Have you ever stopped for a moment, looked around at the world, and felt that something deeper than politics or culture is going wrong? Not just disagreements between people, not just social change, something far more profound, something spiritual. Many people sense it, but struggle to explain it. They see the confusion, the division, the breakdown of values, and the growing uncertainty about what is true and what is not. Deep down, they feel that something fundamental has shifted. For decades, I have spent my life studying theology, serving as a priest, and working in ministries that confront spiritual realities most people never encounter directly. Throughout those years, I have witnessed things that challenged every assumption about the modern world's confidence in itself. I have come face to face with realities that many dismiss without investigation, and others fear to discuss openly. What concerns me today is not that God has abandoned humanity. The concern is that a battle that has been building quietly for generations is beginning to reveal itself more openly. A spiritual conflict that many believers have ignored, minimized, or simply failed to recognize is becoming increasingly visible through the events unfolding around us. The signs are everywhere. Institutions once trusted without question now struggle under the weight of corruption and confusion. Families face pressures unlike anything seen in previous generations. Behaviors once universally recognized as destructive are now celebrated, defended, and promoted. Entire generations have grown up disconnected from tradition, disconnected from the sacramental life, and disconnected from many of the spiritual foundations that once guided society. What we are witnessing is not merely a cultural shift, it is something deeper. To understand it, we must first recover a truth that modern society has largely forgotten. There is a spiritual battle taking place. This is not simply symbolic language. It is not a poetic description of human struggles. Within Catholic theology, there exists a long-standing understanding that spiritual realities are active, intelligent, and organized. The tradition teaches that fallen angels remain beings of immense intellect. Though separated from God by their rebellion, they retain the natural capacities that belong to their angelic nature. That distinction is important. Many people imagine evil as something random, chaotic, or impulsive, but Catholic thought has always described demonic influence differently. These are not irrational forces acting without purpose. According to the tradition, they are strategic, they observe, they study. They understand human weaknesses with remarkable precision. Think about what that means. Humanity has existed for thousands of years. Civilizations have risen and fallen. Kingdoms have appeared and disappeared. Entire cultures have transformed. Through all of it, according to Catholic understanding, spiritual forces have observed human behavior, learning the patterns that repeatedly lead people away from truth, virtue, and God. They know where human beings are vulnerable. They understand pride. They understand lust. They understand despair, greed, envy, and fear. More importantly, they understand how these weaknesses can be amplified across entire societies. This perspective changes how we interpret what is happening around us. Many people explain the modern crisis purely through politics, economics, or sociology. Certainly, those factors matter. But Catholic theology proposes that behind visible events, there may also be invisible influences, shaping human choices and cultural movements. Consider how rapidly society transformed during the 20th century. Within only a few decades, institutions that had endured for centuries faced challenges that fundamentally altered their role and influence. Traditional understandings of family, morality, education, authority, and even human identity came under intense scrutiny. Countless scholars have attempted to explain these changes. Sociologists, historians, political theorists, and cultural critics have all offered valuable insights, yet the Catholic tradition adds another dimension to the conversation. It asks whether these transformations might also reflect a deeper spiritual struggle operating beneath the surface. Scripture itself points toward this reality. St. Paul reminds believers that the ultimate battle is not merely against flesh and blood. He speaks of powers, principalities, and spiritual forces that operate beyond what can be seen with the eyes. This is where many people become uncomfortable. Modern society prefers explanations that remain entirely within material categories. But Christianity has never taught that visible reality is the only reality. The faith has always insisted that spiritual forces play a role in human history. Understanding this requires us to think about civilization itself. Every structure rests upon a foundation. A building remains stable only when the foundation beneath it remains intact. If that foundation weakens, cracks begin to appear. At first, the damage seems minor. Then the cracks widen. Eventually, the entire structure becomes unstable. The same principle applies to cultures. For centuries, Western civilization was built upon assumptions deeply influenced by Christianity. These assumptions included the belief that truth exists independently of personal preference, that human beings possess inherent dignity because they are created by God, that morality is objective rather than invented, and that life ultimately finds its meaning in relationship with the Creator. Whether every person fully embraced these beliefs is beside the point. They formed the foundation upon which much of society was constructed. But what happens when that foundation is systematically removed? What happens when objective truth is replaced by personal preference? When morality becomes entirely subjective? When the family is redefined repeatedly according to cultural trends rather than natural law? When spiritual realities are dismissed as relics of a less enlightened age? The consequences do not appear overnight. At first, society continues functioning because it is still benefiting from the stability created by previous generations. But eventually the deeper effects begin to emerge. The moral consensus weakens. Shared values disappear. Institutions lose credibility. Communities become fragmented. Individuals become increasingly isolated. For decades, many people have watched these developments unfold in slow motion. Now, however, something feels different. The pace appears to be accelerating. Issues that once evolved gradually now shift almost overnight. Cultural norms that remain stable for generations can change within a matter of months. Technologies influence entire populations instantly. Information travels faster than wisdom can process it. Confusion spreads more quickly than clarity. Many families feel overwhelmed by the speed of change. Parents struggle to understand the world their children are growing up in. Teachers face challenges previous generations never imagined. Religious leaders often seem uncertain about how to respond. Even committed believers sometimes find themselves questioning how they should navigate the increasingly complex environment surrounding them, and this is where spiritual awareness becomes essential. Because if there truly is a spiritual dimension to the crisis, then purely political or cultural solutions will never be enough. The problem would be deeper than legislation, deeper than elections, deeper than public debates. It would require a response that begins with understanding the nature of the battle itself. And before we can discuss how to respond, we must first examine something even more unsettling. What years of direct experience in deliverance ministry have revealed about the strategies being used against souls, and why so many people remain completely unaware of them? And before we can discuss how to respond, we have to confront something even more difficult to accept. Over years of work in deliverance ministry, certain patterns begin to appear with striking consistency. These patterns are not based on speculation or abstract theory, but on repeated observation in real cases involving spiritual struggle, healing, and what the tradition describes as demonic influence. Now, it is important to be precise about how this kind of knowledge is understood. Within Catholic theology, any claim coming from a fallen spiritual intelligence is never treated as trustworthy in itself. Deception is considered part of its nature. However, under specific conditions in formal deliverance settings, certain disclosures can be made that align with observable spiritual effects in individuals and communities. These observations, when carefully filtered through theological discernment, reveal recurring themes about how spiritual harm tends to take hold in human lives. One of the most consistent insights is that the modern world misunderstands the nature of spiritual vulnerability. Many people assume that if they are generally decent or socially responsible, they are automatically protected from deeper spiritual harm. But Catholic spiritual tradition has always drawn a clearer distinction. It teaches that protection is not merely about external behavior, but about interior alignment with God, sustained through grace, sacraments, and moral order. When that alignment weakens, the tradition suggests that vulnerability increases. This is where the sacramental life of the Church becomes central. In classical Catholic understanding, the sacraments are not symbolic rituals, but real channels of grace. They are considered objective means through which divine life is communicated to the soul. When these are neglected, the spiritual defenses of the person are described as becoming weakened, not in a psychological sense, but in a theological one. Among the most frequently emphasized practices in this tradition is regular confession. Confession is not merely a psychological relief mechanism. It is understood as a direct restoration of the soul's order toward God. When individuals live for long periods without it, especially while remaining in serious moral disorder, the tradition warns that this creates a condition of spiritual exposure. Another central element is prayer life, particularly structured and traditional forms of devotion. In many accounts from deliverance ministry, there is a repeated emphasis on the stability that comes from consistent sacramental practice, combined with disciplined prayer. The point is not emotional intensity, but continuity and order. Within this framework, certain devotional practices are consistently highlighted as especially significant. The rosary, for example, is not presented merely as a meditative exercise, but as a structured form of prayer centered on the life of Christ through the perspective of Mary. In traditional Catholic thought, this form of prayer is understood to shape the mind and heart in a way that reinforces spiritual clarity and resistance to disorder. Similarly, sacramentals such as blessed objects, holy water, and devotional symbols are viewed not as magical tools, but as extensions of the Church's prayer and blessing. Their effectiveness, in theological terms, is not inherent in the object itself, but in the faith and authority of the Church that blesses them and the disposition of the person who uses them. What becomes clear in this perspective is that spiritual life is not neutral. It is either ordered toward God or gradually disordered away from Him. And according to the tradition, that movement has consequences. This brings us to another recurring theme observed in both theological reflection and pastoral experience: the strategic targeting of formation, especially during childhood and adolescence. From this perspective, early formation is not simply about education in the academic sense, but about the shaping of the entire moral and spiritual framework of a person. When children are formed in an environment of faith, moral clarity, and sacramental life, they develop a stable interior structure. They learn how to interpret reality through the lens of objective truth and moral order. But when that formation is absent, fragmented, or replaced by relativism and confusion, the result is a person who lacks clear spiritual orientation. In deliverance ministry, this is often reflected in the long-term struggles individuals face later in life. Patterns of instability, addiction, confusion, or moral disorientation are frequently understood not as isolated failures, but as the cumulative result of formation that never developed a strong foundation. Another major pattern concerns what tradition refers to as openness to disordered spiritual influences through specific practices or behaviors. These are not always recognized by individuals at the time they occur. Often they appear harmless, cultural, or purely psychological. Yet within the theological framework being described, they are understood as potential points of vulnerability because they involve turning away from God's order and toward alternative sources of meaning or power. What is crucial to understand here is that the emphasis is not on fear, but on awareness. The purpose of identifying these patterns is not to create anxiety, but to clarify where and how spiritual life becomes destabilized so that it can be restored. Because in Catholic theology, no condition is considered beyond healing. No pattern is considered irreversible. No level of disorder is considered stronger than grace. This is where the sacramental system takes on its full meaning. Confession restores. The Eucharist strengthens. Prayer reorients. The moral life stabilizes. When these elements are lived consistently, the tradition teaches that the soul is not only protected, but gradually transformed. However, what many spiritual authors have noted is that the modern environment makes this consistency more difficult to maintain. The pace of life, the fragmentation of attention, and the constant exposure to conflicting messages all contribute to what can be described as interior instability. In such an environment, even sincere believers can find themselves drifting without realizing it. This is why intentionality becomes so important. Spiritual life, in this view, cannot be passive. It requires structure, discipline, and ongoing commitment. Without it, the surrounding pressures of culture tend to shape the individual more strongly than their faith does. And this leads to a critical realization. If spiritual reality is active, and if human beings are constantly being formed in one direction or another, then neutrality is not really an option. Every person is being shaped either toward clarity or confusion, order or disorder, integration or fragmentation. The question then is not whether formation is happening, but what kind of formation is taking place. And once that is understood, the next step becomes unavoidable, examining how entire cultures can shift in ways that reflect not just social evolution, but deeper structural changes in their spiritual and moral foundations, and what this means for individuals trying to remain faithful within them. And once that is understood, the next step becomes unavoidable, examining how entire cultures can shift in ways that reflect not just social evolution, but deeper structural changes in their moral and spiritual foundations, and what that means for individuals trying to remain faithful within them. When we look at history through a purely surface-level lens, cultural change often appears gradual, almost organic. Societies evolve, ideas shift, institutions adapt, and new norms gradually replace older ones. That is the standard narrative offered by sociology and political theory. However, within the Catholic interpretive framework being described here, there is an additional layer that considers whether some historical transitions occur with a speed and depth that cannot be fully explained by ordinary human processes alone. One of the most frequently discussed periods in this regard is the cultural transformation of the 1960s. Within a relatively short span of time, many Western societies experienced rapid and simultaneous changes in multiple foundational areas of life. These included shifts in family structure, sexual ethics, educational philosophy, authority structures, and religious practice. What makes this period particularly significant is not any single change, but the convergence of many changes occurring at once. From a sociological standpoint, this has been interpreted through various frameworks such as post-war economic expansion, technological development, generational conflict, and political liberalization. These explanations carry weight and help describe important aspects of the transformation. However, within the theological perspective being presented, there is an additional question about whether such widespread and synchronized shifts may also reflect deeper spiritual dynamics operating beneath visible historical causes. In this view, the stability of a civilization depends on certain shared assumptions about truth, morality, and human identity. When those assumptions remain intact, even if they are not consciously articulated by every individual, they function as a kind of invisible structure that supports social coherence. But when those assumptions are questioned, weakened, or replaced, the effects can ripple across every institution simultaneously. This is where the analogy of structural integrity becomes useful. A building does not need to lose every component at once in order to collapse. It only requires the weakening of key supports. Once foundational elements are compromised, the effects spread throughout the entire structure. What once appeared stable begins to show signs of stress, first subtly and then more visibly over time. Applied to culture, the foundational supports in question are not simply political systems or economic arrangements, but shared moral and metaphysical beliefs. Within the Christian worldview, these include the belief in objective truth, the inherent dignity of the human person, the existence of a moral law that is not dependent on human preference, and the understanding that human life has a transcendent purpose. When these foundations are replaced by relativism, expressive individualism, or purely material interpretations of reality, the structure of culture begins to change in more profound ways than immediately visible. What emerges is a society in which meaning becomes increasingly subjective, authority becomes fragmented, and moral consensus becomes difficult to maintain. Over time, institutions that once relied on shared assumptions begin to lose coherence. Education, law, family life, and religious practice all begin to reflect the fragmentation occurring at the deeper level. From within the theological perspective, this process is not interpreted merely as intellectual evolution. It is also understood as a spiritual struggle over the orientation of human life itself. The question at the center of this struggle is whether human beings are ultimately ordered toward God and objective truth, or whether they define themselves entirely on their own terms, without reference to any transcendent order. As this shift progresses, The lived experience of individuals becomes increasingly complex. Many people find themselves in environments where conflicting value systems coexist without resolution. What was once considered morally obvious becomes debated. What was once universally taught becomes optional. What was once stable becomes fluid. In such an environment, individuals often experience confusion not only about specific issues, but about the very framework through which reality is interpreted. This contributes to what many describe as a sense of disorientation, where it becomes difficult to determine what is reliable, what is stable, and what can be trusted. Within the Catholic perspective, this condition is not merely psychological but also spiritual in nature. It reflects a weakening of shared reference points that traditionally helped orient individuals toward truth and moral clarity. At the same time, the tradition emphasizes that such periods of instability are not unprecedented. History contains multiple examples of civilizations undergoing profound crisis followed by eventual renewal. These cycles are often accompanied by periods of moral confusion, institutional failure, and social fragmentation before a reconstitution of order takes place. However, what distinguishes the present moment, according to this analysis, is the speed and global scale at which these changes are occurring. Unlike earlier periods in history, modern communication, technology, and cultural interconnectedness mean that shifts in one area of society can rapidly influence others across the world. This acceleration creates a sense of compressed change, where developments that might once have taken generations now unfold within years or even months. As a result, individuals and institutions alike are often struggling to adapt at the same pace at which change is occurring. Within this context, the importance of stable internal formation becomes more pronounced. When external environments are unstable, the capacity of individuals to remain grounded depends heavily on the strength of their internal framework. In Catholic terms, this means the depth of one's spiritual life, moral formation, and sacramental grounding. Without such stability, individuals are more likely to be shaped by the dominant currents of culture rather than by intentional conviction. This does not necessarily happen consciously. Often it occurs gradually, through repeated exposure, normalization of new ideas, and the slow erosion of older assumptions. This is why many spiritual writers emphasize vigilance, not in a fearful sense, but in the sense of awareness. The ability to recognize what is changing, what is being lost, and what must be preserved becomes essential for maintaining clarity in times of transition. At the same time, the tradition also maintains that no cultural shift is absolute. No historical moment is beyond the reach of renewal. Even in periods of deep confusion, individuals and communities can remain faithful, rebuild structures of meaning, and transmit truth to future generations. This leads naturally into the next question. If cultural and spiritual instability is increasing in intensity and speed, what practical forms of preparation and response become necessary for individuals and families who wish to remain grounded in their faith while navigating such a world? If cultural and spiritual instability is increasing in intensity and speed, the next question becomes unavoidable. What does it actually mean for an individual or a family to remain grounded in faith while navigating such a world? Within the Catholic framework being described here, the answer does not begin with external strategies or political analysis. It begins with interior stability. The first principle is that a person cannot respond well to external disorder if their internal life is already fragmented. This is why the tradition places such strong emphasis on the state of grace, sacramental participation, and consistent moral alignment. The state of grace, in classical Catholic theology, refers to a condition in which the soul is oriented toward God through freedom from serious sin. It is not merely a psychological state of peace, but a theological reality rooted in the relationship between the person and divine life. When this state is maintained, the tradition teaches that the soul is more firmly ordered, more stable, and less vulnerable to spiritual distortion. This is where confession becomes central. Confession is not treated as an occasional ritual for comfort, but as a necessary means of restoring spiritual order when it has been disrupted. Regular confession functions as a form of continual realignment, ensuring that the individual does not remain in prolonged states of moral disconnection. In times of cultural confusion, This regular return to clarity becomes even more essential. Alongside confession, the Eucharist is understood as the primary source of spiritual strength. In Catholic belief, the Eucharist is not symbolic but a real participation in the life of Christ. It is considered the central sacrament of the Church, sustaining the believer through grace and strengthening their capacity to live in accordance with truth. When practiced consistently, it provides a stable anchor in environments that are otherwise unstable. Prayer life is the third essential pillar. But within this tradition, prayer is not understood primarily as spontaneous expression. It also includes structured, repetitive, and contemplative forms of devotion that shape the mind and heart over time. The purpose of such prayer is not emotional intensity, but formation. It gradually orients the person toward a stable interior awareness of God and away from distraction and fragmentation. Among these devotional practices, one of the most emphasized is the rosary. In this context, the rosary is not presented as a mere recitation of words, but as a structured meditation on the central events of the Christian narrative. It combines repetition with contemplation, creating a rhythm that reinforces stability of thought and intention. Its value lies in its consistency and its ability to integrate belief into lived experience over time. Closely related to prayer are sacramentals, which include objects such as holy water, blessed medals, crucifixes, and other items set apart through the Church's blessing. Within Catholic theology, these are not treated as sources of power in themselves, but as extensions of the Church's intercessory prayer. They serve as tangible reminders of spiritual realities and are used to reinforce the presence of faith in daily life. What becomes clear through this structure is that Catholic spirituality is not passive. It is highly structured, intentional, and repetitive. It is designed to shape not only belief but behavior, perception, and response to reality. In times of instability, this structure becomes even more important because it provides continuity when external conditions are unstable. Another essential element is formation in doctrine. The tradition emphasizes that believers are not meant to rely solely on external authority figures for understanding their faith. Instead, they are called to learn the content of the faith directly through reliable sources, ensuring they can recognize when teachings are consistent with tradition and when they are not. This involves engaging with foundational texts and teachings that have historically shaped Catholic theology. The purpose of this formation is not intellectual pride but clarity. A well-formed mind is less easily confused by shifting cultural narratives and more capable of discerning truth amidst competing claims. Alongside individual formation, community plays a critical role. The Catholic understanding of the faith has always been communal. Believers are not isolated individuals, but members of a body. In times of crisis, the strength of that body becomes especially important. Shared prayer, mutual support, and collective perseverance help sustain individuals who might otherwise feel isolated or overwhelmed. Historically, periods of instability in Christian communities have often been met with the formation of smaller, more intentional groups centered on prayer, teaching, and mutual encouragement. These communities do not replace the wider church, but help sustain its life in challenging times. They become spaces where faith is lived concretely rather than abstractly. Prudence is also emphasized as a moral virtue relevant to this discussion. Prudence, in the classical sense, refers to the ability to make right decisions in concrete circumstances. It involves foresight, responsibility, and careful judgment. In uncertain times, prudence requires individuals to take reasonable steps to ensure the well-being of their families and communities without falling into fear or excessive anxiety. This includes attention to both spiritual and practical responsibilities. While the primary focus remains spiritual stability, the tradition does not dismiss the importance of responsible planning in the material order of life. Families are encouraged to act with foresight and stability rather than reactive panic. However, the most important element in all of this is the interior attitude with which these practices are lived. Fear, in the spiritual sense, is considered one of the greatest obstacles to clarity, not the healthy awareness that leads to responsibility, but the kind of fear that leads to paralysis, despair, and loss of trust in God. The tradition consistently emphasizes that fear distorts perception. It narrows vision, weakens judgment, and isolates individuals from the broader reality of divine providence. For this reason, spiritual preparation is always paired with trust. The goal is not to become anxious about the future, but to become stable within it. In this sense, preparation is not only about what one does, but about who one becomes. A spiritually formed person is not defined by the absence of difficulty, but by the presence of stability within difficulty. That stability is cultivated through repeated practices of prayer, sacrament, moral discipline, and community life. As this framework becomes clearer, another question naturally arises. If individuals and families are called to such a level of spiritual awareness and formation, what does this imply about the broader condition of the Church itself, especially when those entrusted with leadership are themselves subject to the weakness, confusion, or failure? This leads into a deeper and more sensitive dimension of the discussion: the role of the Church's human element, its vulnerabilities, and the consequences those vulnerabilities have for the faithful who depend on it for guidance and grace.